We're at a couple of minutes past the hour and looks like numbers have started to stabilise. So let's get started, shall we? Welcome all to the next seminar in the SPEPA series. SPEPA, for those that haven't heard this before, is the Strategic Partnership for Implementation of the Paris Agreement, and it's effectively like a knowledge exchange and some research activities set up between Europe and a series of bilateral countries, in this case Australia, to really try and support stronger climate action. It started a few years ago, and it's really worked through the kind of changes in the policy and political environments that have taken place over the last few years. As part of that, the University of Melbourne, through Melbourne Climate Futures and the Climate and Energy College, is running a series of seminars, and we've covered a good range of topics over the last few months. We're now actually into the last month of the program, still covering a broad range of things and quite a few things still to come. And today it's a delight to welcome Judy Bush from the University of Melbourne. Judy Bush is part of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and working on a whole range of areas around urban greening. And urban greening is, as we'll hear, clearly relevant for climate, but also relevant for a whole range of other things around improved urban amenity, biodiversity, and other aspects of positive urban environments. Judy and I have worked together on various things over time, kind of in an urban context. And so it's a delight, Judy, to welcome you back to talk about urban greening, probably particularly in the context of climate, but also more broadly. So I will mute myself and step off video and hand over to Judy.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for the welcome. It's lovely to be invited to be part of this series, and I'll share my screen. So I hope you can all see that. As Peter said, I'm talking today about the intersection between urban greening and climate change. To start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their custodianship of country and their deep knowledge, which they are so generously sharing with all of us today. So today, as we've said, I'm focusing on the intersections between urban greening and climate change, and in the Australian context. So we know Australia is both highly urbanised and increasingly coastal, and therefore extremely exposed to climate change impacts. And, you know, here's an infographic summarising some of those. So, you know, as we all know, we're all very familiar with those ideas of sea level rise, increased bushfire weather, extreme rainfall events, and so on. Heat waves are indeed one of the key climate change impacts. So this sort of representation of the relationship between the urban heat island effect, which really is a, you know, sort of chronic character of urban areas caused by the removal of vegetation and the increased use of dense building materials which absorb heat. That then interacts with heat waves, which we can think of as acute experiences. And so urban heat island effect adds degrees to heat waves. And then, of course, climate change on top of that is really an amplifier of urban heat. So there's the relationships between urban greening and climate change in a nutshell, or one of the elements of those relationships. And we know from experience to date that heat waves are one of the most deadly disasters, natural disasters. And we know also that vegetation is one of the most effective mitigators of urban heat. So we can see those really close relationships between biodiversity and climate change, even when we just think about urban heat. But indeed there are many other linkage points as well. And so that's why I'm here today to talk about those relationships. So what I'm going to be covering today in my talk is, first of all, talking about urban greening and heat mitigation, then looking at the other functions and benefits of greening, thinking about some of the policy and implementation examples that we're seeing recently, particularly centred in Melbourne. And then I'll be talking more broadly about integrating climate change mitigation and adaptation across built environment. And that's reporting on a research project that I'm part of that's received funding from the Australian Research Council. So first up, urban greening and climate change, and focusing on urban heat mitigation. My PhD that I completed in 2017 was part of a project funded through the Low Carbon Living Cooperative Research Centre, and we looked at urban cooling strategies. And you can see here that greening and vegetation play a really important role in the suite of ways that we can address urban heat mitigation. So green envelopes, green walls, green roofs, and tree canopy are important contributors to cooling urban areas. So some of the really interesting research has actually attempted to assist us in thinking about how to prioritise areas for heat mitigation. And this work by Norton and colleagues highlighted that we need to think about exposure, vulnerability and activity. And the high priority areas are those areas that are hottest, that are perhaps the most vulnerable from a socioeconomic perspective, and that are areas of behavioural exposure. So let's think about, for example, the active transport routes, getting to schools, health and retail and sports areas during heat waves. And the work by Norton and colleagues really talked about a stepped process of prioritising urban greening to address heat mitigation. And so I really like this idea of stepping through the scales from city to neighbourhood to street to micro scale, and really thinking carefully about those different elements that go into prioritising where greening should be located and how it should be integrated into the urban fabric to really prioritise heat mitigation where it's needed most. Some interesting work from a practitioner perspective has also looked at cooling for vulnerable people, and this work from Moreland City Council and Moreland Energy Foundation trialled a number of different programs that included providing shading, water tanks, pedestal fans, and also providing trees for residents to plant in their gardens to contribute to heat mitigation. Interestingly, it also identified these other sectors or domains that need to be addressed. So those social networks, the financial elements of electricity bill support, and then the idea of cool refuges. And this idea of transport, of getting to and from cool refuges, really again reinforces that idea of the behavioural exposure that was highlighted by Norton and colleagues. So this idea of active tree roots was also part of the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub research. This really interesting project, Shadeways, looked at the idea of shading bike lanes and walking tracks to encourage active transport even during hot weather and heat waves. And the Shadeways project actually incorporated crowdfunding and crowdsourcing to identify existing cool routes, to share that information with others. So when you're mapping how to get from A to B, it's not just about the shortest route, it's also about the coolest route. It's certainly something I think about as a bike rider. I prefer riding down streets with tree canopy cover rather than exposed streets. And while we can certainly highlight the exposed streets as needing supplementary planting, I think being able to provide information to support bike riding now, not just in 10 or 20 years' time when the canopy has grown, is really important. So obviously with heat mitigation, we also need to think about some of those other exposures, those other outdoor uses in urban areas. That includes obviously outdoor workers and public events like sports events. And so this photo is taken from the tennis Australian Open a couple of years ago during a really intense heat wave. But of course, we know that cities are also important for biodiversity. And so we need to think about how to ensure the ongoing resilience of biodiversity populations during heat waves. So that leads me on to the next section and thinking about policy and implementation for urban greening. So of course, in the Australian context, we are living on an island of which the oldest continuous culture, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people as traditional owners, First Nations people, have incredible deep knowledge and custodianship of country. And we inherited an incredibly biodiverse and culturally rich heritage. Australia is also the driest continent on Earth and, as I said earlier, highly urbanised with large cities on coasts. So we're really exposed to a range of climate change impacts. But importantly, cities are also hotspots for biodiversity. So cities provide habitat to some species which are not found outside city areas. So we need to very much have an eye on urban greening in cities and to think about creating resilient networks of urban greening. So about this time last year, the UN Environment Programme released this report, Making Peace with Nature, which is a pretty, in some ways, quite a confronting title, because in some ways it implies that we are indeed at war with nature. It makes the point that ambitious and coordinated action by governments, businesses and people around the world can prevent and reverse the worst impacts of environmental decline by rapidly transforming key systems. And as I've said, as I've argued, because cities are important for biodiversity and because we depend on urban greening, everyone has a role in this process of making peace with nature. And policy and implementation are important elements of that. So in thinking about greening policy, we can potentially use the concept of nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are ecosystem-based approaches to address the societal challenges of climate change, food security, water security, disasters, human well-being and economic well-being. And so nature-based solutions is an interesting policy-based, research-based approach to implementing ecosystem-based approaches. It sort of arose, it's probably a European term, so it's not yet particularly widely adopted in policy and practice in Australia, but it's probably starting to gain some traction. The thing that's perhaps useful about it is that it provides a shared language that crosses disciplinary boundaries, and it really focuses on a systems approach. And it foregrounds that challenges solutions focus and very much embeds the idea of benefits for both people and biodiversity, which I think is super important, particularly in an urban context. So we know that greening cities have multiple benefits. So we've already talked a bit about responding to climate change and cooling cities. We know that urban greening can also contribute to managing water runoff quality and quantity, to biodiversity conservation and restoration through providing habitat, definitely through cultural heritage and really fostering a sense of place, social cohesion, community connections, and so on, and an opportunity for urban dwellers to be able to connect with nature in the city. And we know this is really important for people's mental health and mental and emotional health and well-being. And certainly many of us experienced that during various COVID lockdowns that we've experienced here in Melbourne. Those of us who have had access to nature and to high quality parks, open space, waterways during those lockdowns have certainly really appreciated that access. And in fact, my Zoom background is a photo I took during one of the Melbourne lockdowns, and it's the Birrarung, and this is within 5 kilometres of where I live. And you know, I've lived in this house for quite a number of years, and I had never explored this bit of the Birrarung until lockdown. So yeah, I'm super lucky to live within 5 kilometres of this amazing location. So anyway, we know that urban greening provides multifunctional urban infrastructure. And I want to put in a little plug here for Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub, an amazing research hub that continued for 6 years, spanned research from across Australia, and the key research findings were brought together in this publication, Cities for People and Nature, which is available from that link there. It's an amazing publication. It includes summaries of the incredible breadth of research that was undertaken by the hub. It's also got embedded videos and so on. So it's very much a very engaging way to delve into some of the recent research. So in terms of implementation and policy of urban greening, some of the key ingredients that we know are important. This is from a paper by Nick Williams and colleagues, including both Peter and John and myself. This is a different Rainer. 10 years of greening a wide brown land. This is green roof research, but a lot of it relates also to other forms of urban greening. So some of the key ingredients are related to gathering and sharing knowledge, collaborating and advocating for greening, governance and leadership. So we know that leadership is a key element. Having a suite of policy mechanisms, so not just relying on regulation, but also including incentives and community engagement, information provision is also really important. Fostering skills and expertise amongst both policymakers, implementers and the community. And designing for success, so having an eye to maintenance, in recognising that urban greening needs to survive and thrive into years ahead. So integrating function and form and having an eye for maintenance. In recent research that we had published last year, we highlighted intermediaries' roles. So those key actors who can build collaboration and link across different policy domains, link between researchers and practitioners, link between policymakers and implementers. And so intermediaries have key roles in building collaboration, informing and disseminating policy learning, and strengthening political support. And of course, a critical element in implementation and policy approaches to urban greening is foregrounding traditional owners and their aspirations for land and water. And a really significant example that we can point to is the Birrarung Act and the establishment of the Birrarung Council, which includes a requirement for traditional owner membership of that council and traditional owner voice to the council. As part of strategic approaches to implementation and policy, we can look to some of the recent policy development here in Melbourne. Plan Melbourne includes a cooling and greening objective, which has then been picked up in the Living Melbourne strategy, which was developed by Melbourne's local governments and with input from DELP, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Resilient Melbourne. And Infrastructure Victoria has recently included canopy cover targets, which have then also been picked up in Victorian Planning Authority's precinct structure planning. So we can see how strategic objectives in overarching strategy, Plan Melbourne, has then filtered down into a whole range of other guidelines, strategies, action plans, and so on. These canopy cover targets are also complemented with other actions for greening to cool cities and multifunctional green spaces. And in research that I was part of that looked at scaling up nature-based solutions and analysed the Living Melbourne strategy, we highlighted the role of multi-stakeholders being necessary for scaling up nature-based solutions to ensure that implementation responded to specific contexts. So, for example, the Living Melbourne strategy covers the greater metro area. It's really important to have that local government input, because local governments obviously know their local area and their local context. So in talking about canopy cover targets, that can be a key driver for planting trees in urban areas, but seedlings and saplings take a while to develop the canopy that we need to be able to cool our urban areas. So it really highlights the importance of retaining trees in urban areas, and as well ensuring that we plan and allocate sufficient space to enable healthy canopy and root growth. I reinforce the importance of space for roots, of tree roots. You know, often if we're establishing trees in urban areas, street trees, the trees often have to share the underground space with underground utilities, and this can then endanger the tree health if those utilities need to be accessed. So there's actually a call for locating utilities under footpaths so that tree root disturbance is minimised if there's the need to access them. You can also see here this photo showing the difference in urban fabric, urban landscapes. This particular example, 2010, you can see this, these single houses with substantial backyards and you know, substantial tree canopy, replaced 8 years later by not just black roofs, but also no space for trees. And certainly in research undertaken by the Call Hub and additional research actually last year by a master's student, Jacob Zamoro, has shown that a lot of the canopy loss in urban areas is happening in private development. So this is a serious issue that we really need to engage with. So in thinking about future needs for implementation and policy, we definitely need to think about public land, but we also need to think about private land. And as I said earlier, we need to think about combining different sorts of policy mechanisms. So policies, we need to look at planning schemes, local laws. We need to think about financial incentives, and we need to be able to set minimum standards and enforce those minimum standards, but then encourage and potentially incentivize best practice that very much exceeds those minimum standards. So we've got a building code for urban areas for building. We need to develop a greening code. And we need a greening code that incorporates those elements that I talked about on that previous slide: minimum standards, enforceable and enforced. So one approach to a greening code has been the recent development of Melbourne's Green Factor tool. So this is a tool linked to new developments for the City of Melbourne, so the inner urban municipality. It provides a policy mechanism to really ensure increased greening in new developments. And it does that by defining a minimum area of greening, and it's underpinned by strategic policy priorities and a research evidence base. So I was lucky enough to contribute research to underpin the development of this tool. And the tool really highlights the ecosystem services, or the greening functions that are provided by Urban Green. And then these were assessed by City of Melbourne's policymakers to identify which of these were priorities from a policy perspective, and then they were weighted. And that weighting then goes into the calculation of the green factor. So you can see here that based on City of Melbourne's policy priorities, the urban temperature regulation or cooling function of greening was given the highest weight. City of Melbourne also have a strong focus on urban ecology and biodiversity. So habitat values of urban greening were given a weighting of 20%. And you can see those values down there. These social and community values add to 25% as well. So together those social and community values are also of high priority for the City of Melbourne. And you can see here that this is how we then sort of constructed the scoring that then goes into the calculation of the ultimate green factor score for new developments. So you can see here that large trees score more than medium trees, which score more than small trees or climbers, and so on. And you can see that lawn and turf don't score particularly well for a range of other factors compared to large trees and so on. the green factor tool is currently available for use by developers and so on through these URLs here. It's not yet a regulated part of the planning scheme, but the City of Melbourne has endorsed its inclusion in the planning scheme, and so it's waiting on the planning minister for a decision on that. And you can read more in this open access article here about the research that went into the creation of the green factor tool. So we know that planning needs to address space for nature in urban environments, including on private land. And we know that that needs to happen during development, but also across the built environment's life stages, and certainly during redevelopment processes, as that photo that I pointed out with the black roofs so starkly represents. And we know that that greening is relevant across residential, commercial, and industrial contexts. So that leads me to the second part of today's presentation, and talking about the research that I'm undertaking, looking at integrating climate change action across built environment sectors. This is an ARC, Australian Research Council, Discovery grant funded project. 2020 we started, and going until probably next year, actually 2023. We're looking in terms of how we understand climate change integration in the built environment. We're looking at how at the integration of adaptation and mitigation, but we're also looking at integration across the built environment sectors, which we are thinking of as urban design, urban planning, property development, and construction. So yeah, integration across all those life stages. As one of the first elements of this research, we conceptualized the built environment process. So we represented those stages of the creation, use, management, and decommissioning or renewal as this sort of horseshoe-shaped process. So we aimed to identify the key sectors, the key actors, and the key actions in this process. As you can see, it's a horseshoe. We understand that it's not a linear process, and cities are continuously being made and remade. They evolve and change. So we tried to represent the process as almost a cycle. We didn't represent it as a true cycle because we recognize that not every element of built environment work actually links up again. And you'll also see these lines between linking across, so leapfrogging some of the processes within the built environment creation and maintenance. So this recognizes that not all built environment development processes happen in a nice, neat sequence of events. So just looking at what these stages are, because I imagine you can't actually read the text on this image, we understand the stages to start with change initiation, strategic planning, project consideration and initiation, design, costings and approval, construction, use and ongoing management, and renewal, recovery, and decommissioning. So they're the stages that we have identified and documented in built environment process. The key sectors and actors, as I said, include property, planning, design, construction, and we've got an others category, of course, which we include allied professionals such as engineers, business and finance, science, and so on. And so the reason why we developed this process map is to inform and underpin further research. And so that further research is identifying and expediting opportunities for coordinated action to address the societal challenges of climate change action. So to embark on this next step of the research in this project, we undertook a literature review to look at how climate change preparedness is reflected within research literature. And we used a framework based on Moser and Lewis that frames 3 elements to climate change preparedness. Those 3 elements are awareness of climate change, analytical capacity to understand climate change information and science, and then action. So actually implementing the necessary responses. And then also in investigating the barriers and facilitators to that preparedness. So in this paper here, that has been recently published in Environmental Science and Policy. This is a pretty snazzy figure representing the key barriers that we found in the literature to climate change action. And those barriers, the point of this diagram is linking the different types of barriers to then the different sectors on our built environment process map. So you can see here that the barriers are risk evaluation, roles and responsibilities, funding and costing, policy regulations, knowledge, timeframes, clients and community engagement, and conflicting priorities and tools. And then we tried to show how these are associated with the different sectors and the different stages in the creation and maintenance of the built environment. We also identified key facilitators for climate change action and likewise linked them to the different sectors here. So I won't go through all those. You can see them represented here on the slide, and you can certainly read them in this journal paper here. So just to summarise the key findings from the research to date, we've found that there's a lack of research on addressing climate change adaptation and mitigation concurrently. So there's a lack of that integration of adaptation and mitigation, and most of the research literature to date has focused on adaptation within the built environment, I should add. Sector-based research largely fails to link to other sectors or acknowledge the cross-sectoral or interdisciplinary opportunities and constraints. So people are sticking within their policy domains. Property focuses on property, planning focuses on planning, and there's a lack of linking to that sort of the broader built environment process or the sort of the spanning of different sectors and different stages. In contrast, though, there is a growing area of research on the science of cities and urban systems that really foregrounds complexity, interdisciplinarity that is necessary for climate change responses across the built environment. And arguably, some of the research on nature-based cities is very much engaged in this domain here of the science of cities and urban systems. And yeah, so there's an increased focus on ecosystem-based approaches, nature-based solutions for climate change responses. And these also reflect that interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral and complex systems approaches. And inherent in this research often is the consideration of co-benefits and trade-offs associated with these approaches. So the next steps in our ARC funded project, some of which are well and truly underway, are interviews with built environment actors from those key sectors to investigate their state of climate change preparedness and also their perceptions of the barriers and facilitators for climate action. And we're also very much now in the stage of engaging with identifying the key policies related to built environment and climate change action, and looking at policy integration and policy mainstreaming. And we aim to, from this research, develop a framework to guide climate change integration across the built environment. So to sum up my presentation today, returning to the idea of urban greening and climate change, I would definitely argue that we need to reconceptualize nature as essential urban infrastructure, and we need to make the case for nature in cities, and often this actually requires making the business case for nature in cities. We need to think about scaling up and scaling down. So very much creating a connected, multifunctional, co-managed network of urban greening in cities. We need to acknowledge that addressing climate change and biodiversity need to come together because they're indeed intersecting crises, and there's an increasing number of governments, industry associations, other organisations declaring climate and biodiversity emergencies, which really highlights that sense of intersecting crises. And so therefore interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity are very much required to be able to address those climate change and biodiversity crises together. And in doing so, we need to foreground Indigenous perspectives. It's essential for research design and outcomes. It's also essential for policy and implementation. And you can see here a photo of Zena Cumpston, who was a research fellow in the Call Hub, and this really fabulous research synthesis, Cities Are Country Too, illuminating Aboriginal perspectives of biodiversity in urban environments, also downloadable from the Call website. So urban nature requires all of us to become stewards of urban nature. We all need to take on the role of protecting and restoring nature in cities, and recognising and acting on our responsibilities and obligations of stewardship to nature and to each other. And, you know, that I return to the idea of the Making Peace with Nature report. And another quote from there: shifting worldviews and putting nature at the heart of decision-making is key to achieving transformative change. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Judy. That's fantastic. For those of you that haven't been here before, we're going to hand over to a Q&A section next, which Angela's going to curate. I'm going to abuse my privilege as host by asking the first question, which is, and I really like your point about the fact that thinking about mitigation and adaptation together is something we're quite poor at. You can see this from the very top of the IPCC pyramid, that this process is split thinking. And so the idea that there are things that offer benefits on both sides of this equation often get kind of underweight consideration because of this problem. And related to that, I'm going to ask a question about governance. Do you think we have the structures available at local government for actually considering the full range of benefits that are offered by things like urban greening and urban nature, or is there something else we need to do structurally? Obviously, there are questions of money and resource, but are there things we need to do structurally to make sure that these benefits are kind of represented properly across the whole of government, either at local levels or at state levels?
So I'm going to answer your question. Thank you, Peter, for kicking off the Q&A with a really interesting question. I'm going to answer it in two parts, I think. One part is to say that I think we're increasingly recognising the importance of urban greening as a multifunctional approach to addressing a whole range of urban issues, and you can see that in some of the policy documents and so on that I pointed to in this presentation. But I also think that we're not yet good at spanning across sectors, and I have a sense, and I may be proved wrong. I welcome some examples from maybe some of the participants here today, but I have a sense that, for example, if we look at declarations of climate and biodiversity emergency, I think there's a recognition that these issues are linked, but then in the action responses to these declarations, we tend to then revert to a sort of separated and sector-based approach that says, okay, we've got to deal with climate change and biodiversity crises. How do we do that? Okay, well, let's deal with climate change mitigation with these actions. Let's deal with climate change adaptation with these actions. What about biodiversity? Oh, let's talk to the urban ecology and open space team about that. And so I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do in the governance space to really develop mechanisms for being able to integrate action and responses and planning and strategic development across those sectors.
Thanks very much, Judy. I'm going to jump in now with some of the questions from the Q&A, and I'm going to invite the people who've asked the questions to ask them themselves. So first I'll go to Charles, who's got a great question here about how greening and cool roof coatings can work together.
Thank you, Charles.
So you can go ahead and ask your question, Charles, if you'd like.
Oh, sure, Judy. It's just me, Charles, you probably know me from ThermoShield and Dominique Hess for years now. You know, always a fan of your work, supported Canopy for a decade. Again, I'm just about complementary systems, and obviously the outcome is what we're all after, not, you know, pushing a particular barrow. So we've been modeling, you know, urban heat island for some time, and Fisherman's Bend is going to come up, and, you know, as you said, new developments. So I just see the opportunity to integrate greening and, you know, other technologies, and I'm not spruiking mine particularly, but you know, we've gotten into like huge infrastructure projects doing level crossing removals, and you know, but I'm always happy to put my hand up to contribute. So I've just been wondering if anybody's been modeling, you know, the combination based on the infrastructure we have of cool roofs and greening. Because I've been, as you know, pushing forever, and I tried to do monster projects, and you just can't green everything. So just as, you know, using all the tools in the toolbox is, I guess, what I'm putting out there.
Yeah, great point. And really that's sort of one of the first slides that I showed, that slide from the CRC for low carbon living, really reinforced that, you know, there's a whole suite of responses and mechanisms for urban cooling. And yeah, you're right that we can't fit trees everywhere. I think it's really interesting looking at some of the research, for example, looking at performance of solar panels installed on green roofs, and green roofs can help to cool solar panels, which then increases their efficiency or energy generation. So, you know, it's interesting thinking about how to use mechanisms together, but it's also, as you say, we need to think about how to cool urban areas using a range of different types of cooling. So yeah, cool roofs. There's certainly, you referred to Dominique Hess. I think Dominique has actually published some research looking at comparing the benefits of cool roofs and green roofs. So yeah, I'd point participants, if they're interested, to having a look at some of that research.
Thank you.
Alrighty, our next question is from David Phillips. So David, I'll invite you to go ahead and ask your question if you'd like to.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Judy, for the comprehensive overview. Yeah, look, I'm very interested in urban heat sinks and the potential for greening to cool things down. And I guess in listening to your talk, it looks so broad and so many parts involved that I guess I'm really interested in trying to influence local government in adopting some of these measures. And I just wondered, where would you start in terms of talking to local government?
Yep. Thanks, David. Thanks for your question. So, and I noticed in the Q&A, you talked about, you know, this presentation being very Melbourne-centric, which indeed it is. And what about regional and smaller cities? So, indeed, that is an issue highlighted in research. One of the CALL researchers, Dave Kendall, wrote a research paper a couple of years ago highlighting that a lot of urban greening research is either in European cities or in, you know, large cities in Australia and the US. And we need to think about how to green the regional cities like Hobart, for example, where Dave's now based, and other regional areas and smaller cities and so on. So super important that we also point our attention to those areas. So there's a couple of examples that I have been involved in recently that are aiming to, for example, bring in local governments in Victoria, local governments outside Metro Melbourne. So the Green Factor tool that I talked about in the presentation, there's a group of local governments under the umbrella of CASB, which is the Council Alliance for Sustainable Built Environment, got the acronym. And that is a group of, I don't know, a number of local governments from both Metro Melbourne, but also regional areas working to increase sustainable built environment approaches, largely through planning processes. And they've been looking at how to roll out the Green Factor tool to councils other than the City of Melbourne. I know that it's being trialled in a couple of other metro councils, but I understand that CASB were also interested in thinking about applying it in regional towns and rural cities as well. So that's one example. Another example I want to point to is a project I'm working on at the moment for the Goulburn Broken Climate Alliance, which is a grouping of local governments in sort of northeast Victoria, and they're looking at naturally cooler towns. And so they're actually looking at mapping the current status of trees in urban areas in these rural and regional towns, and with a view to encouraging their member councils to actually focus on urban forestry and urban greening projects into the future. So yeah, there's a couple of examples there. I think it's important that we do more research in in cities other than the large metro areas, because we need to build the evidence base and build the sort of research literature in contexts other than large metro cities. But nonetheless, I think local government is quite good at sharing information across their sector.
Thanks very
Thank you.
much. We've got one more question here from Jack Halliday. So Jack, please come along and ask your question, after which we'll pass back to Peter to wrap up with some final remarks.
Hi, it's actually Helen Halliday that's asking the question. I'm from the city of, I live in the city of Port Phillip, and I must say, after 10 years of avid effort on trying to encourage greening, the outcomes are small. And for instance, we've been working for 3 years to get one street in one area to have canopy cover consideration made, and we're still waiting for the final tree planting, and we actually don't know what the design outcome is going to be. My question, therefore, is the state government has a lot of information. DELP in particular is doing a huge amount of work on canopy cover. Would it not be the best way forward to actually simply require councils to ensure that all their roads are covered with a green roof? Is what my ambition would be, so that instead of us having to argue with them all the time about where and when, we can just point to a requirement that says each year you've got to increase your canopy cover by whatever percentage may be achievable within that area. In our particular area, we've got a 10% canopy cover, and we believe that there is an opportunity for a 45% canopy cover.
Yep. Thanks, Helen, for your question. Yeah, it's I suppose it's an ongoing question amongst policymakers and also amongst researchers, the boundary between regulation, enforcement, and incentives. So certainly, as I mentioned, Victorian Planning Authority in their precinct structure plan guidelines that they released in November last year have set a target of 30% canopy cover in new developments in growth areas and so on. And as I mentioned, Infrastructure Victoria have also highlighted a 30% canopy cover target. I think it's really important and significant that for example, Infrastructure Victoria is talking about canopy cover in an infrastructure plan. So that really is shifting towards the idea that greening is part of our necessary urban infrastructure. As for whether the pros and cons of enforcement of regulation that would then require enforcement, that is a huge question that I don't have time to answer. But all I can say now in this short amount of time left is that best wishes for arguing for increased canopy cover in your area. And I think you're being given more and more support in the shape of policy targets and research to really support the increase of canopy in your area.
How does 1.9% sound? That's our current target increase.
Yeah, it's I think you highlight another issue that we are all faced with, and that is the urgency of action. And, you know, this is a key issue for climate change. It's a key issue for urban greening. It really reinforces the importance of retaining existing trees in our urban landscapes, because, you know, canopy takes 10, 15, 20 years to establish. But meanwhile, we are faced with climate change trajectories that are following the worst case scenarios. So we need to be pulling out all stops. We need regulation, we need incentives, we need community engagement and encouragement, because our task is urgent and large.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now? That sounds better. Yeah,
Yeah.
Thanks very much to Judy and for the questions, and to Helen. I hear the lament. It's something I remember from times talking to people in Western Sydney and kind of all over Melbourne about maintaining the impetus and the funding, not just the mandate, but the support to actually keep trees healthy and growing for long enough for them to really make a difference. It's a continuing struggle. And my dream would be getting enthusiasm for increased canopy cover that lasted more than one federal minister. That'd be a start. And thus far, that's not really happening. Hopefully, we can get a little more continuity at state level. Thanks again to Judy. Just a note that we have a range of upcoming seminars. They're coming thick and fast during February as we kind of backload a whole range of things that we've been stacking up. So there's a seminar on Thursday, a webinar on Thursday, and then some more coming over the next few weeks, including some of you will have seen a sort of major wrap-up event. We're going to bring together a whole range of things that we've been involved in across the Knowledge Network for a kind of 3-day blitz late in February. So keep watching the space for details, and hopefully can welcome some of you back to future seminars.